Hi everyone, me again with another drum video. I'd just like to firstly say a big thanks to everyone who watched, supported or shared the other video. It did really well, much better than I expected, so thank you. I hope you found it useful or interesting. But a few people get in touch say that they're now thinking about taking up drumming, which is absolutely amazing, and a couple of others who said they just watched it because they found it interesting. And obviously some other people who were looking at taking up drumming and found the technique tips quite useful. So big thanks to everyone who tuned in, I really appreciate it. As I've mentioned at the end of the last video, for this lesson I thought I'd look at drumming music and how to read drum music. As I mentioned before, it's fairly straightforward, so I hope you're not too intimidated by it. It's much easier than probably the stuff that you might have learned at school or even kind of playing guitar or piano or whatever it was, but it feels to me at least like a much more palatable way to read music. It was my entry into reading music, and certainly reading other types of music can be quite complicated, but I find drumming quite simple. It's quite formulaic, nice easy route to get your teeth into, like as I mentioned before, similar to guitar tablature. So I thought before we get to any playing, we'll have a look at the bar and what it contains. A bar is part of a piece of music that obviously contains notes within it that reflect what you would play. Typically at the start of a bar, at the very start of a piece of music, you'll notice some numbers. Most traditionally within almost every form of pop song, a lot of rock songs, and most kind of nice to the ear pieces of music, you'll see some numbers called 4/4. There'll be a 4 over a 4, and that means there'll be 4 beats per bar. So within the bar you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you go back to the 1, 2, 3, 4, and this feels naturally quite nice to our ears. We're quite simple in our auditory taste, so it feels quite nice, and the drumming reflects that. Another time signature that you might get, probably the second most common one, is 3/4. 3 beats per 4 bar measure, which is kind of like a 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, much more of a waltz. Out there is hundreds of different types of time signatures. You get 5/4, you get 7/8. I think the most obvious version of that is probably Times Like These by the Foo Fighters, which I think is in 7/8 or 9/8, I can't quite remember. But equally, the better musicians get kind of playing together, the more they'll fuck around with time signatures. Bands like Meshuggah especially just have some crazy stuff like that. Tool as well use a lot of bonkers time signatures. You know, they're really kind of trying to push the boundaries of what music is and what you can do. And 4/4 some people can, because they can become repetitive and boring because it's so pleasing on the ears. But for now we're going to stick with 4/4, get our heads around that, what a time signature is, and we'll take it from there. As I mentioned before, so you have 4 beats in your bar, so that's 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4. Often with things like metronomes there'll be an accent on the 1, so if you're listening you can understand where the 1 is again in case you're getting a little bit lost. What you'll then have after that is a lot of shapes, often with a circle and a thing on the top of it. The traditional names, so if the note that you're going to play is going to last 1 beat, then it's a crotchet, and that's your, if it was 1 2 3 4 for instance, a row of crotchets across the stave would be like this. The next note that you're most likely to see on there is called a quaver, and that's half the time of your crotchets, so you get twice as many within the beat. So in your traditional 1 2 3 4, you get 1 2 3 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and the next step is half of that note length again, which is a semi-quaver. So in a 1 2 3 4 you get. So that's what you'll see on your sheet. Now for today we're going to stick with our hi-hat, snare drum, bass drum. You can have a play around and try and learn these if you want, but they can be quite frustrating and quite complex initially to begin with when you're looking at first time types of coordination. It's purely just to demonstrate where the notes actually live on the stave. So with the bass drum, traditionally on the first beat and the third beat, you'll notice is on the line for F. Now if you go back to school, the gaps in between the staves spelled out face from the bottom upwards, F-A-C-E. So the bottom one is where our bass drum sits, in between the 2 lines. It makes sense, the bass drum is the lowest sounding part of the drum kit, so it's right at the bottom. So that's your bass drum, 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4. Next on the C, the middle C, you'll get your snare drum. And the snare drum is quite mid-range, so it makes sense to kind of slam it in the middle there. It's also quite pleasing on the eye, and it's a really easy reference point again because it's sandwiched in between those two lines. So F, your bass drum, A, nothing yet, and then C is your snare drum. And on a 1, 2, 3, 4, that will look like this. What you'll have across the top for your cymbals is X's. Now, for a closed hi-hat, you'll have an X on the top line, which would be an F. That'd be a nice closed hi-hat. That's kind of the basics of what should appear in front of you on a basic rock beat. The other thing that you might notice at the start of the piece of music, alongside the 4/4, there'll be a number, an equals sign, and there'll be a crotchet, and that's your beats per minute, which is usually timed with a metronome. Now, average is probably about 120 beats per minute. That's one beat in between, obviously, every second. A lot of the snare drum rudiments start at 90 beats per minute, which is, you know, a fairly nice time. It's not too slow, so that it's quite hard. It can actually be super hard to play something like 30 beats per minute because you're so tempted to just skip forward and play the next note. But it's not too fast that it's quite challenging. The key thing that I learned throughout playing drums was that if you're struggling, slow something right down, pull it down to 60 BPM and play through it. Or don't play it through it with the metronome, or just slow it right down. But that number will represent the time or the speed that you're going to play the song. So I've got a metronome here. You can kind of manipulate the beats per minute. It has a headphone output, which is useful. Obviously, if you're playing drums, it can be quite hard to hear sometimes. You don't necessarily have to shell out for an actual metronome if you want, if you're just practicing at home with a practice pad. If you just Google metronome 90 beats per minute, Google has one inbuilt, and you can just hit that and listen along and see what it's like. So just for reference, this is 90 beats per minute, and I'm going to play a rock beat along to this. So you hear how there's the accent on the 1. 1, 2, 3. And how that translates. So I'm going to do the bass drum on the 1 and the 3, and the snare drum on the 2 and the 4. Then I'm going to pull the hi-hats in on the 1 and the 2 and the 3 and the 4 end. Crotchet, quavers. I might throw in some semi-quavers just so you understand how it fits in. 2, 4, 2, 4. So that's today's lesson. So that's kind of the basics of everything that you need to understand on a musical version of playing drums. The next lesson we're going to look at a ton of snare drum rudiments. Again, we'll keep them at 90 beats per minute, so if you're going to run through them, have a metronome handy, whether it's on a laptop or however you want it set up. You'll be able to literally play them on your hands, and the same with that. If you're interested, I know it's a huge investment to just buy a drum kit, but if you want to have a go, you can play the hi-hat with your right hand, the snare drum with your left, and then just practice with your right foot on the bass drum. You know, a lot of drummers will play left hand on the hi-hat, right hand on the snare drum, because that's just their coordination, how they feel comfortable. A lot of the guys will play completely opposite. If you're left-handed, you might play with your left hand on the hi-hat, the literal opposite, right hand on the snare drum, and your left foot on the bass drum. It's similar in kind of skateboarding and surfing and snowboarding, where you have goofy foot and regular foot. Traditionally, because right hand dominant, we'll play the right hand on the hi-hat and left hand on the snare drum. But figure it out for yourself. You know, I effectively got shown this, and I spent hours and hours and hours practicing on the tables in school, not paying attention to any of my lessons. I just focused on playing a rock beat, and I remember specifically being sat in science and being able to do it, and I felt like my head had exploded. I never been so happy. So that's the rock beat. That's how it's broken down. That's how it's shown on a piece of music. As I mentioned, I don't expect you to be able to play it, but if you want to have fun and mess around with it, feel free, because the coordination's quite fun. It was purely just an exercise to show you how that translates into drumming music, because there will be some drumming music coming, obviously, that we're going to have to look into. So yeah, so next lesson will be some snare drum rudiments of kind of beginning grade 1. So look forward to it. Thanks again for watching. I appreciate every single one of you who gives me a like or share or comments. It really means a lot that people actually give a shit. So thanks very much, and I'll see you in a bit.